afternoon. Thank you, Vakar. I'll take my hat off because I'm sweating already. It's good to see so many familiar faces. Faces here from my school, Marina, age 11. There are faces, of course, that come with me since birth. And there are others here who have been colleagues of mine for a number of years. I'm pleased to see that Peter Crockcroft is here because that weather this afternoon, Peter, was atrocious, and we may need to get some advice off you before we go home. Of course, most of you will know me as a television journalist, and there is a myth that television journalists can't string a coherent sentence together for longer than 2 minutes. So today might be either a challenge or a test, and you can give me marks out of 10 once I'm finished. See how we measure up as television journalists. So there are many, of course, who wanted to be here, but can't be here for one reason or another. They sent their apologies, and they're with me in spirit. I'd like to thank Michael Driscoll, Vice-Chancellor, Deputy Vice-Chancellor Vakar Ahmed, Caroline Upton, the Dean of Performing Arts and Media, and Janet Jones, who's the Head of Department, who have, along with other senior staff at Middlesex, welcomed me wholeheartedly and encouraged me to be bold. Perhaps they'll find out sooner rather than later how bold I intend to be. It is, I must confess, a little daunting to look out on this group of people and see that it reflects some of my life's journey. But before I rekindle my academic fire, if you like, which I put to one side 25 years ago, and embark on this new professorial journey, there are a few people in particular I want to thank publicly. Firstly, there's this man. This man is my grandfather. He bequeathed to me a sense of honest working class wisdom. And Joseph Barling, as he was, Sidney Joseph, inspired my academic achievements right at the beginning of my career by telling me he would be really proud to finally know a real doctor. Unfortunately, he died a few months before my successful viva in 1989. My parents, who are here in the audience, but also they're here. There's me in the middle of them. There's my father as a handsome young man. They have, for many years, kept me with my feet on the ground. I thank them for that. And then, of course, there's my best friend and my life companion. There she is. There she is again. She's somewhere else. There we are, the Taj Mahal. Who's travelled this journey with me since we were 18. She's made countless sacrifices of her own along the way to support me and our 3 children. There they are, Naomi, Nathaniel, and Joseph. She's always kept me on my mettle. And after forgetting to thank her in my PhD speech nearly 25 years ago, I'm finally publicly repaying that debt of omission. So 25 years ago, I began a journey. It was a journey which started in many ways, as for all of us, started with our past. This is the Barling family around about 1910. These are some of my African roots. Here are some of my roots, spiritual and intellectual, in Germany. These are my young brothers and sisters. My brother is here in the audience. And much as what I am, as all of us are, starts in those days. But 25 years ago, I had until then a pretty successful academic career, as Vakar has said. At the age of 26, I'd earned my place in the history books at the LSE as the first black British lecturer in its entire history. My subject was international relations. I'd arrived at the LSE following in the proud footsteps of another Joseph Barling, who's here in the audience, my uncle. Our family obviously believes in the economy of names. I had been inspired in my first years at the LSE, listening to lectures by great men and women, like Professor Susan Strange, International Relations, Professor Chris Hill, now Professor at Cambridge, International Relations. Professor James Mayle, now retired, but also at the University of Cambridge, and my very great supporter, Professor Fred Halliday, who unfortunately died an untimely death. But one single lecture stood out from all of them when I heard Emeritus Professor of Philosophy and Scientific Logic, Sir Karl Popper, who just occasionally used to come back to the university and offer us young students words of wisdom. I confess, as a young student and a non-philosopher, I often struggled to follow much of his argument, but there was one thing that really stuck in my mind. It was his concept of the open society and the need to preserve it from its enemies. It kind of flicked a switch in my mind. I interpreted that sense of the open society as a powerful message to underpin a society whose members should be able to openly criticise the institutions and the structures of power without the fear of reprisal, where the citizen is educated as distinct from indoctrinated, where society is able to flourish in all the ways that are natural to it, without the impediment of the constant supervision of the state. At its very simplest level, as the son of a German who lived through the Third Reich, I was deeply affected by this logic. It made real sense to me at a human level. It gave my studies a sense of purpose and stimulated my sense of vocation, initially in scholarship, but then, for a quarter of a century, my career as a journalist. For me, Popper brought clarity to my emotional ambition to create enlightenment where there was darkness, knowledge where there was ignorance. As a child and in my teens, I had, in some shape or form, experienced darkness and ignorance in abundance, and my lifelong interest in extremism is rooted in that early appreciation of the cost humanity bears for plain prejudice, or in extremis, as my father was to learn as a young boy, unbridled terror. My vocation, therefore, is rooted in a deep sense of injustice. The more or less constant exposure, I would argue, to prejudice and ignorance, even at low levels of intensity, and I speak personally, still gives me a different insight into many stories that I cover. It's often sent me off in a completely different direction in search of answers to those of my peers, much to the annoyance of many an editor. So for me, maintaining an open and plural debate has always been both a fundamental and necessary objective of journalism. The Le Figaro masthead has an elegant phrase that captures this as a journalistic aesthetic. It says on the masthead every day, sans la liberté de blâmer, il n'est point d'éloge flatteur. For those of you who don't speak French, without the freedom to criticise, there is no true praise. In 1985, of course, I was seduced by a couple of scholarships to pursue my PhD studies at LSE. I began to see this scholarship and journalism as two pathways that might work in a complementary way for me. But by 1989, a mixture of naivete and idealism, and perhaps a smattering of youthful arrogance, maybe not a smattering, got the better of me, and I told myself if the open society that Popper had instilled in me needed journalists, then journalism needed me. To know the meaning of things is the LSE motto, and for me this was not an end in itself, but a call to pursue this idea that an open society needs stout defenders. When it came time for me to leave the LSE, and I felt it in my heart, it was no longer a place for me, it seemed logical to pursue my ambitions to become a journalist. I can remember my great friend and colleague, Mark Hoffman, who's also here, asking me, over coffee, when I decided that I was going to leave, what on earth do you want to do that for? And I gave what I thought was a rather robust, if not romantic, answer to the effect that I thought there was an absence of deep thought in British journalism, and perhaps I could succeed as a young academic critical thinker, bringing some academic forensic skills to bear on the profession. Of course, with extraordinary prescience, Mark observed all those years back, a quarter of a century ago, that I would go off to Ponzi TV, make a name for myself, and in a couple of decades I would come back as a professor to tell academia how to liven itself up. So Mark, if you ever did place that bet, don't forget my share. I was, of course, also guided by some simple principles learned in that Anglo-Irish, German, African home. Without journalism, only one truth prevails. The truth of demagoguery and the self-serving interests of those who seek power and then are determined to hold on to it. That was the lesson of the National Socialists when they burnt their books. You don't need to be a historian to accept that story. You do need a set of values to guard against it being repeated. Before the cynics of you say, of course, I was tempted away from academia by the lure of filthy lucre, because academics do not earn a handsome living. I'll just clarify for the record, if it was money, I made a damn fool decision. Why I became a journalist has always been an important part of my journalistic aesthetic. It still informs my view of how I should conduct myself as a journalist, and my firm belief that a strong subversive or element of contestation as the French would have it, should run through all journalism. First, it was personal. My grandfather worked on the printing presses at the Daily Mail. He was father of the chapel there for many years. He sold the Morning Star and the Tribune. He was a man of high ideals, but also of great pragmatism. And he had, by daily bringing that diversity of thought into the house, from the Daily Mail to the Morning Star and the Tribune, brought into, in a sense, framed my natural curiosity. My enduring admiration for him has skewed my ambition. The second Joseph Barling, also here, encouraged me. He said, he was at the Manchester Guardian and the Sun before Rupert Murdoch took it over and made it a slightly different newspaper to the one where he was foreign editor. He said it would give me an interesting life. He was right. But my actual decision, although delayed by that PhD, was taken in October 1985. By sheer fluke, I stumbled into the Broadwater Farm riots, the most notorious, or by no means the worst, in British history. This is the title page from a film I made about 10 years ago, looking back at those terrible riots. The murder of a decent, hard-working community policeman, PC Keith Blakelock, made them the worst that we'd seen. The events have been sparked by the death of Cynthia Jarrett after police raided her home. She too was a hard-working mum who'd come from the Caribbean to raise her family. The riots at Broadwater Farm still inform parts of the police-community relations in London, which remain in many communities very tense, as we saw back in 2011. My brother-in-law, who was 18, lived very close to the estate, 50 or so metres in fact from where the Molotov cocktails started raining down on police. I, ever enterprising, tried to rescue him as the place went up in flames. What I saw on the ground that night, as I stumbled into those riots, was so at variance with what I experienced in the news coverage later that day and in the ensuing weeks. I asked myself, how could that possibly be? On that night, one part of the farm burned. We know those images all too well. Whilst the rest of the Broadwater farm slept peacefully, as if nothing had happened. I happened upon both places, and it made me realise how fragile our grasp of the truth can be, and how finding the pathway to the truth is a real jungle of riotous confusion and inevitably compromise. I told myself that a sort of cultural dissidence happened because journalists often see what they want to see and report what they see through a very narrow prism, coloured by their own view of life from their particular standpoint. At 26, I had my own standpoint, informed by my education at the LSE, that meant I saw things differently, and in my personal life I thought that by becoming a journalist I could influence that narrow discourse. A dominant singular narrative can conspire to mould the facts that the public then accepts as read. One headline in particular stuck in my mind from that time. It described this man. Obviously he's not a man there, he's a young boy. He was the leader of the council in Haringey, Bernie Grant. And they described him as the high priest of race hatred. It was the Home Secretary Douglas Hurd who described him effectively as a black separatist. I got to know Bernie very well during the last years of his life. What was interesting was that, in fact, through his adult life, Bernie Grant had only been married to white women, a strange occupation for a separatist. He had, however, expressed views that ran counter to the prevailing dominant narrative. He paid a heavy price for it. That is why I decided to become a journalist. If we take the wrong turn as journalists, we can blight a lot of people's lives for a very long time. Broadwater Farm remains a byword for mayhem. Its reputation has still not recovered from that night in 1985. In 2004, I made this film, 90 minutes, on BBC Two. It needed a lot of explaining. It showed me that it was still a traumatised community. It remains so. And I have to report, it wasn't traumatised from the riots, but from the press coverage. From this beginning, I've been drawn to ask myself time and time again, what should be my method? What is my USP as a journalist? Well, I think it's this. Popper explored the poverty of historicism. And I've come to believe, similarly, that there is such a thing as the poverty of the dominant elite-driven narratives of journalism, driven as they are often by historical precedent. In layman's terms, it must be right because we've always done it that way. In my body of work, there's always been a common theme. To improve public debate, you have to search for and articulate the alternative narrative. Without this, as far as I'm concerned, journalism is redundant. In this talk, or professorial lecture, I've chosen a number of stories from the thousands that I've covered down those 25 years that I think are emblematic of this search for the alternative narrative. I hope, this is where we'll get the marks out of 10, that they indicate the quality of contestation or subversion of beliefs, attitudes and assumptions that should be the bedrock of journalism to serve to underpin Popper's open society. I joined the BBC in October 1989 at the rather mature age of 27. It was not and has never been an entirely comfortable world, as my wife Kim will tell you much more candidly than I would. All my fancy ideals were quickly put to the test. On my first assignment for the BBC, working on a programme called Heart of the Matter, that many of you may recall, with Joan Bakewell. I was dispatched very green to Berlin in November 1989. It was, as Vaccaro said, a baptism of fire. George Kennan described journalists as eyewitnesses to history. Fortunately for me, making a film about the fall of the Berlin Wall was pretty much the ideal scenario for fulfilling that particular description. Not only were the events I witnessed obviously historic, but I was quickly exposed to the reality that there is no such thing as entirely objective and value-free journalism. Of course, like most students in the social sciences, I'd read sociologist Stuart Hall's work on this at university, but it's always good to learn these things for oneself. I happen to agree with Kennan that journalism is fundamentally a history of the present. But the Berlin Wall experience taught me it was important to have a healthy skepticism about what you accept as fact. This picture is a fellow called Stephen Ellery. When I arrived in Berlin, late at night, the day after the wall opened, I turned a corner and I saw him sitting on the Berlin Wall. And I thought, what a lunatic. He's going to get himself shot. And of course, in that moment, I realised the world had changed. I made a film with Stephen 20 years later. He's still as mad. If we accept journalism as a history of the present, we had better get it right, or the historical view of the event can be easily corrupted by that first draft. As Hall has argued, facts are social constructs, and editors in newsroom, like most people, prefer facts that are consistent with their general view of the world. Selected facts are conditioned by those dominant narratives of the day that I've already alluded to. Unfortunately for my editors, and fortunately for the audience of the BBC, a German had raised me and had given me an alternative narrative of German history. It informed my journalism on that story. But I was also genuinely shocked by how many cliches other journalists could trot out as fact. Of course, Popper would have it that there's no such thing as history. There can only be many different partial histories, all fragments of an understanding of the past. But if we, as journalists, are at the junction where history is both written and given meaning, then it follows that journalism has powerful responsibilities. The journalist's view can have a corrupting impact on the historical narrative. I've had constant reminders over the years of how our own sense of identity is wedded to how we interpret our history. This couldn't be clearer, of course, ahead of a year where we'll spend a lot of time, money and effort commemorating our version of the 1914-18 conflict. But when I stepped off that plane in Berlin, I'd been a journalist for all of 4 weeks, but my own family upbringing had taught me how easy it could be for others to be prisoners of a past defined by historians. I felt a very powerful responsibility to gather facts on the front line of the Cold War and be super careful how I presented them. Because, as E.H. Carr says, history is written in the present. As a journalist, I learned very quickly I had to set aside prejudice, both personal and intellectual, and cope with that kind of perceptual distortion that afflicts us as journalists when we're under stress. And unlike historians, we can't deploy hindsight to craft the narrative. We have to work contemporaneously, using a mixture of forensics, critical thinking, sound judgment, and instinct to reach credible conclusions from the evidence before us. The facts were not certain in Berlin. Every utterance had to be scanned for hidden meaning. The wall had come down, we knew that, but would it stay down? Would the tanks roll in? Or would the whole affair prove to be a seismic shift in world politics? It depended on many things, but above all, interpretations differed according to which side of the wall you lived on. The wall had been breached, fact. East Berliners were all happy, not fact. Some were positively terrified. West Berliners were all happy. Not fact. Some worried about those Russian tanks. Freedom reigned. Not fact. Not yet, at any rate. It was, said one academic, the end of history. Not fact. It was not obvious what would happen. No one in 1989 could have predicted Osama bin Laden. That environment set a template for my career. It taught me that prescription and prediction can shred the reputation of a journalist in a couple of stories. I come back to Hall. Media facts are never neutral because the ones that get transmitted are socially manufactured messages which carry many of the cultural dominant assumptions of our society. To me, it seemed at the time rather ironic that as a heavily disguised Germanophile in a brown British skin, I was able to get a very clear sense of how prejudice was influencing that narrative. Many people I spoke to assumed I knew nothing of German history. I'd like to thank them for that. It was a very important lesson I learned very early. Sometimes it's the search for the alternative narrative that helps us subvert our assumptions of self and helps us refashion a fresh image of who we really are. I've often been drawn back to Popper's argument on historicism and how we as a society attribute meaning through history. It is a theme I've often returned to in my work. What if journalists only ask questions that are presented to them? What if the facts that aren't in plain view are never sought? What if they choose to ignore facts that are staring them in the face? What if they accept all past histories as gospel and don't seek to uncover hidden truths from another time? What if they don't consider alternative narratives? As a child, like many children, I went to Trafalgar Square to see and feel the spirit of the past. I went there with school. I went there obviously with my parents. Age 10, I went there with my cousin Joseph Barling. Yes, I know, another one. I travelled there on the 25p Red Rover bus. Joe and I, enthusiastic and excited about this adventure from Palmer's Green. Trafalgar Square is of course a symbol of our Englishness, a place where citizens have always gathered to protest and celebrate, to reflect and mourn, revel and revere, all under the gaze of a man who delivered us from the French. Lord Nelson kept Parliament in his gaze, reminding us of the reasons for our enduring greatness. At least, that's how the story goes. Then one day, not so many years ago, by pure chance, I noticed on one of the bronze friezes at the bottom of Nelson's column an African that reminded me of the importance of refracting history through a different lens, as I'd seen in Germany. It set me thinking about who the African was and what on earth he had to do with Nelson. It's important to know our history. It's equally important to know who shaped it, and not just who wrote it. I certainly never learned at school that Africans were shoulder to shoulder with Lord Nelson aboard the Victory when we were delivered from the French. The column, as you will know, was constructed in 1840, and John Carew's depiction of the death of Nelson must have depicted some kind of reality aboard the Victory. I consulted some naval historians, and their answers led me to the House of Lords and the celebrated painting by Daniel Maclise of the death of Nelson. What I saw there reinforced my view of the importance of exploring alternative narratives in order to make our national story relevant to all our citizens. Black faces painted right onto the wall of the House of Lords in 1864. They've never been removed. It will take another century, of course, before a live blackface entered that place as a peer. The truth is, Nelson had hundreds of black sailors, and some were aboard that good ship Victory when a French sniper shot him. That fellow there is pointing out to the Englishman, the Frenchman who's just shot Nelson. Get him. Filming the story with Lord Herman Ouseley, we stood in front of this painting for well over an hour. He told me he thought that most of his peers of the realm who passed that painting for well over a century would not recognise the importance that that should have for our sense of history and nation building. The purpose of journalism must always be to subvert attitudes, beliefs and assumptions. To get people to reflect on the deeper truths of our society that may otherwise never be fully articulated in mainstream discourse. Back to Hall. He says media facts emerge in a social context that fosters systematically structured over-accessing by the media of those in powerful and privileged institutional positions. Thus, the media tends faithfully and impartially to reproduce symbolically the existing power structure of power in society's institutional order. Put it another way, people with powerful egos and big mouths get heard first. That's where journalists should come in. The Glasgow Media Group used detailed content analysis to pinpoint just how distorted facts could become through the journalistic prism. The news is not a neutral product. It is a cultural artifact which carry the culturally dominant assumptions of our society. Herein lies one of the strangest arguments for journalistic subversion or contestation. The citizen requires more than one answer to a problem, more than one remedy to resolve conflict. Journalists must be at the coalface of that democratic imperative. Journalism must lend assistance to the plurality of voices that need to be heard in a democracy. Often, powerful interests will distort or withhold evidence, to skew, even kill outright, the story. There will be inaccurate facts and competing interpretations of reality. Worse still, lies, half-truths. In fact, some of my investigative journalist colleagues go as far as saying that we have become a corrupt and corrupting profession. When Nick Davis wrote Flat Earth News in 2008, building on research undertaken at Cardiff University, he argued that government and corporate propaganda, half-baked stories invented by PR agencies, and other empirically suspect material had stuffed the news agenda with falsehoods. Marshalling credible evidence to deliver confident description and sound analysis should be the bedrock of a journalist's reputation. And we all know there's plenty of call for a subversive attitude in everyday Britain. A patient goes in for a hernia operation and loses a leg. A mental health patient dies after being forcibly restrained by police. An oil spill pollutes a coastline. Exam boards repeatedly lose exam papers. A newspaper decides the story is more important than the privacy of a missing child. But we know that quality costs money because it requires devoted resources. And in our age of austerity, quality has been one of the things that I believe has most suffered. As the management class focus on technological solutions to drive down costs in journalism, their obsession can smother the subversive instinct because it's more about workflows and process than journalists and journalism. The current demise of quality journalists at the expense of technology reminds me of a joke I once heard. How many news editors does it take to screw in a light bulb? One. But first they need a committee and a project to rewire the whole building. Comment is free. Opinions overflowing. Gathering facts is an expensive business. In fact, the motivation to cut back on news and current affairs programming in the mainstream has been intensifying for over a decade. Commercial channels have effectively vacated political and economic current affairs journalism to good old boring BBC. If you take a look in the rearview mirror to another age, you can see that where there was analogue scarcity, the regional ITV news model, for example, prevailed. As soon as the new digital spectrum opened, a free-for-all bundle for advertising revenues meant the coverage collapsed. Powerful interests, meantime, can draw on plenty of resources, not always their own. Is it me, or have government departments, national and local, spawned huge communications teams? These professionals create persuasive cases that their master's narrative is the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. As a journalist craft their narrative, they must recognise that there are contradictory, even hostile forces at play. They need a subversive instinct to preserve them from being hostages to propaganda, whatever its source. In this increasingly challenging and competitive journalistic space, young journalists need the resilience and tools to master this powerful assault from spin and misinformation, particularly when the story becomes a long-running one. They need patience, the courage of their journalistic convictions. I believe they should also have a commitment to the citizen. Nearly 20 years ago, I covered my first death in custody case when a young man in South London was bludgeoned to death by a police officer. Brian Douglas's family fought long and hard to find out the truth about how he met his death late at night in a police encounter. As a young reporter, it was my job to report on the case. Inquests, trust me, test everyone's patience. But when well conducted, they're a model of searching for the truth of the matter. There's something very compelling about watching a lawyer test the logic of evidence. It's something every trainee journalist should learn from. I'm pleased to see that Roy Greenslade agrees with me in his article last week in The Guardian. In the ensuing years, I've covered numerous deaths in custody: Roger Sylvester, Harry Stanley, Sean Rigg, currently Shelley Lewis, last night Terry Smith, Fillmore Mills, Mark Duggan. It strikes me that increasingly editors are retreating from covering these important processes that search for the truth, and as a consequence we do a great disservice to the public. Of course, in these cases, journalists can see the facts being tested, or not, as the case may be, in areas where the state has its gravest responsibilities to protect the citizen's right to life. Reporting law is an arena where lively minds can counter the subversion of truth. Court reporting is a dwindling craft that threatens the process of justice. Back in 1927, Ernest Hemingway identified the characteristics he believed made a great writer. These qualities are undoubtedly as important as they ever were. Hemingway said, in order to be a great writer, a person must have a built-in, shock-proof crap detector. A prerequisite for this is a skeptical mindset. University journalism courses should be in the business of cultivating just such people, experts at crap detection. Healthy skepticism is a journalistic condition. One of the tenets of democratic society is that men be allowed to think and express themselves freely on any subject, even to the extent of speaking out against democracy. The Fourth Estate is an instrument of such a society. The point of journalism and journalism studies at university, it seems to me, is to educate a generation of journalists and communicators with an awareness of the freedoms associated with democracy, but also a will to exercise critical thinking and perspective to help the citizen to gather information and speak out effectively. There's no time to develop the argument here, but I fear that universities must guard against an overweening professionalisation of journalism. The profession makes a bargain with the state through the University Academy to license its professionals to practice. They are registered. They are regulated. If they breach the norms and standards of the profession, they are deregistered and banned from practicing. Now, of course, that might work for an obstetrician. I'm happy it does. But journalists are not obstetricians. We're engaging in an activity which is unregulatable, the freedom of expression. It is for the law of the land to hold errant journalists to account. Only authoritarian regimes license journalists, and we have plenty of evidence where that leads. Becoming a profession is antithetical to the aesthetic of journalism. There is more clearly a discipline of craft in journalism, the process an artist engages in to realise their aesthetic. Not all craftsmen, of course, are artists, but all artists must understand their craft. Authentic journalism is an art, not a science. So how are journalists to guard against the sources of fact-fixing in the public discourse that are mostly found right at the point where the media players interact with public and private institutions? And journalists do have to guard intensely against swallowing someone else's truth. In journalism, facts may be sacred, but as I've already suggested, they are not neutral. They need to be chewed over, considered carefully, before being digested and regurgitated on our screens or in print. Truth is an ideal. In reality, a version of the truth is negotiated. It is a compromise rather than an absolute. Sometimes it's only by acting subversively that a journalist can navigate towards the truth. Sometimes the journalist is faced with the problem that there are a shortage of empirically verifiable facts. All that we have is what we as individuals can see, breathe and feel. Then it is the unregulatable instinct and experience that lead you slowly towards the truth that is the compromise. When Lynn Aubrey wrote to me in 2007, Lynn's here, she told me a story of a teenage boy. And if I can get this thing to work, I will show you that teenage boy.
Kurt, you need to close the icon on the screen.
Haven't got a mouse. Mouse.
Anyone see it?
Ah, no, I have got a mouse.
Yeah, there you go.
Here we go. Mouse. That's a young boy, self-image of himself. And the other person there, by the way, is me. When Lynn wrote to me in 2007, she told me a story of this teenage boy who'd been in the United Kingdom for 14 years, but was about to be deported to Africa. Her letter was desperate, saying she'd called, written and spoken to solicitors, the Home Office, the British High Commission in Nigeria, the Nigerian High Commission in London, local authorities, building societies, schools and anyone else who would listen. Tunde, she believed, was Nigerian, based on a single weather-beaten scrap of paper he had. I met Lynn and her frightened charge at home and promised to try and piece together Tunde's story and verify his identity. The scrap of paper was torn off a fragment of a birth certificate issued in Lagos in Nigeria. I could not verify his identity, or could I corroborate his story. I believed his story though, but without documentation, publication was going to be really difficult. I was having to wrestle with truth, but with an absence of verifiable facts. Inertia in officialdom was dictating a narrative of, let's call it, unknowing. I borrow that concept from Gita Sereny, one of my favourite writers, who when writing about Albert Speer said, Albert Speer being Hitler's architect, concluded there was a bureaucratic condition she described as the art of unknowing something. It was self-evident to me that young Tunde existed. I saw him, I smelt him, I felt him. But he was unknowable, officially at least. He was a non-person. No public agency was willing to help Tunde. He'd been offered a place at university. He was a very gifted animator. This is one of his gifts. He couldn't take up his university place because the local authority couldn't help with his origins or when he'd arrived in the country, despite the fact he'd been in their schools since the age of 6. He had no formal identification, so to all intents and purposes he did not exist once he'd been trafficked into the United Kingdom, into a life of domestic servitude. Now, over a period of a year, through contacts in Nigeria and veiled threats of exposure to various public officials, by saying I would do a piece to camera outside their building, their complicity in hiding a suspected victim of trafficking, we discovered who Tunde was, Lynn and myself, where he'd come from, and we got him granted permission to stay. Tunde's story was a reminder that sometimes subversion is the only course available to a journalist to rectify a wrong in the absence of hard-to-pin-down facts. We worked for months. We found his identity document. We found the handwritten school inventory that the teacher said did not exist. We discovered how long he'd been in Britain. We obliged the authorities to provide him with a viable status. We secured him his university place. He took up a university course. And for Lynn and I, it was one of the proudest days of my career when we shed a tear or two at his graduation ceremony. Despite the fact that we never nailed his smugglers, never prosecuted the authorities for failing to deal with a child in slavery, never gave him his childhood back, it was a powerful reminder of the investigative journalist's duty to try and change people's lives for the better. In many ways, the story of terrorism that emerged after the 9/11 attacks was and remains one of the biggest tests to our willingness to subvert attitudes, beliefs, and assumptions. The truth requires forensic attention. Subversion sometimes means identifying inconvenient truths and facing danger and serious risks in order to share them. Journalists spend whole lifetimes struggling to negotiate pathways through the undergrowth of implausibility to get to the truth. In order to subvert these implausible narratives, journalists need the skills and tenacity to check the sources of their facts for robustness. In 2000, I began a long-running investigation into the state of governance in Britain's mosques. I'd uncovered evidence that subverting the truth had become a way of life for some mosque committees. And when imams occasionally abused children, they would often be spirited away to Pakistan in a hurry, without any recourse to justice. I'd come across several incidents where this had happened, but no further action seemed to be taken. It had all the hallmarks of the scandals engulfing the Catholic Church, but the mainstream didn't really care. It was a minority, a culturally specific problem. For over 18 months for Channel 4's Dispatches programme, I investigated how some mosques were failing to regulate themselves in the interests of their worshippers, which left worshippers vulnerable to abuse or worse. They were actively seeking to cause harm to others beyond the mosque, not just sexual abuse within. At Finsbury Park Mosque, we uncovered a hive of terror-related activity, and even children being subjected to radicalisation by Abu Hamza. Some of the evidence we gathered was done so from an MI5 agent undercover in the mosque. The authorities were not prepared to intervene. We struggled to broadcast the evidence of wrongdoing for fear of being prosecuted for libel or being accused of Islamophobia. For several months I was locked in a ritual of email jousting with Abu Hamza's lawyers accusing me of racism. At times we had to sail very close to the wind on the law too, raising the question, of course, of whether it's right for journalists to break the law, to expose lawbreakers. We were due to broadcast in November 2001. In September, the attack on the Twin Towers meant our broadcast was pulled for fear of inflaming tensions across Britain against Britain's Muslim communities. But in reality, they have feared being accused of Islamophobia. We had to fight hard against the din of people worried about being accused of racism, to remind people what the facts showed. Abu Hamza was a man willing to foment hatred and violence in the name of Islam. And many people in the Muslim community wanted the authority to stop sitting on their hands and intervene to protect them. In fact, to this day, many activists allied to Muslim organisations credit my film, Trouble at the Mosque, as helping change the culture of regulation within Britain's mosques. I found myself in a situation where journalism was trying to expose the subversion of the truth from all sides. Abu Hamza, the police authorities, the Charity Commission, the media itself. The objective of the subversion, a misplaced sentiment to avoid being perceived as racist or discriminatory. History, of course, has proven me right. And the decision to continue to press for publication, which eventually happened 7 months after 9/11, was a lesson in the contradictory forces against which journalists must often battle. I hope, by the way, that the book I've written on this story with the former MI5 agent will find a publisher soon and will go to print before Abu Hamza faces trial next year. However, now the dominant narrative is a fatigue with this story. Robust documentary evidence was ultimately our strongest instrument of counter-subversion and defence. My experience has shown over and over again that journalists should start by disassembling the facts presented to them in order to establish an empirically plausible version of events. Our task is to craft narratives that can stand the test of publication, public challenge, and the courts. There's one final form of subversion that I would like to address as I come to this final part of this lecture. Sometimes journalists also have to be subversive of the conventions of journalism, and in particular a bland and simplistic notion of objectivity. The prevailing wisdom is, don't get too emotionally involved. Keep a distance. Report the story and move on. Notional objectivity should not mean, however, utter detachment from your subject. On the 7th of July 2005, the day after London had won the Olympic Games, myself and a BBC cameraman were up a mountain on the border of Uganda and Kenya. We were filming with some poor coffee farmers who had their livelihoods transformed by fair trade. We were surrounded by practically every villager on the plateau. We were attempting to do a piece to camera. Our high-tech camera fascinated them, but mostly the rare sight of a light-skinned black man and a white man fascinated them even more. As we were about to turn over, David got a text on his phone. We did have smartphones. It was about 9:30 in the morning. The text said, serious accident on the tube. It's been closed down. Dave and I froze. Then came another text, worsening news from London. We had to get back, of course, to do the piece to camera. It was the work in hand, and of course entertaining the farmers. But I distinctly remember thinking, what am I doing here now? I described it in an article that I wrote shortly after that as the day of 1,000 sorries. Everywhere we went, people were sorry and compassionate for what had happened to our city. I felt a desperate urge to get back home, to be part of telling people what was happening in our great city as those bombs had been detonated. That's perhaps when I realised how important journalism is to me and to us as a community. It keeps us connected in times of crisis, but it can also make sure that we feel less alone. Whilst we were up that mountain, getting more miserable, Thelma Stober was stuck underneath a tube carriage at Aldgate. She'd narrowly missed being killed outright. Although through quick thinking of people around her, her life was saved, although unfortunately not the lower part of her leg. She was rushed to hospital, where treatment saved her life, and she underwent a very strong recovery, although haunted by her experience, like many hundreds who were caught in the devastation of the tube bombings. I met Thelma when I returned from Africa. She sought me out as one of the few journalists, in fact, the only journalist she was willing to speak to about her experiences. She had a particularly tricky problem which she needed me to help her with. She is from Sierra Leone. She is black, but the hospital wanted to give her a white prosthetic leg. Actually, both Thelma and I spent a lot of time laughing about it at the time, but after my intervention, she got a very nice black leg. And we struck up, as a consequence, a very trusting relationship. That was back in 2005. And I said to Thelma at that point, because I knew it would be a long journey for her, I would like to follow her back to work firstly, which she did a year later, but even then onto the tube, naively thinking it might be 6 months after that. But when she was ready, she said she would never ever be ready to go back on the tube. For several years I continued to report on the trials and tribulations of Thelma and other survivors of the bombings, including their wish to see a public inquiry. It was, by the way, one of the times when public service broadcasting was at its best, trying to help people piece their lives back together. Anyway, the point of this story is about a journalist's trusting relationship with a subject and the need sometimes to subvert the conventions of journalism and show real compassion and engagement. In 2011, after 6 years of asking, Thelma finally decided that she would like to try to finish the journey to Aldgate Station from King's Cross, one she'd never completed. It was the first time since 7/7 she'd even smelt the tube. This is what we found.
At the memorial of the victims of 7/7 in Hyde Park. Riz.
Thanks very much, Victoria. Yes, a very serene atmosphere here. Well, the trauma of the bombings still haunts many Londoners. We've spoken to one survivor, Thelma Stober, several times on how she's coped. She lost part of the leg in the attack at Aldgate. This week, Thelma decided to face her darkest fear and got back on the tube for the very first time. Our special correspondent, Kurt Barling, was with her.
On several occasions since that fateful day, Thelma has tried to take the tube. Each time, anxiety has stalled her plans. Today, once again, Thelma aims to complete the journey she wasn't allowed to finish.
I want to go on the same coach as I was.
It looked like our journey might finish before we started. The trauma of 7/7 ever present. For the survivors and families of those killed, the inquest has offered some closure. For many, there's still a traumatic legacy. By the third train, Thelma was determined to press on.
This is where I'm trying to relive 7/7. This is where I was standing.
The city of London.
The day before the bombings, London had secured the Olympic Games. Thelma, the senior lawyer on London's bid team, was rushing to catch the train to put the finishing touches to the Olympic documentation.
I ran from there. I ran and I just got on here and moved here. I was going to sit down and then somebody came and got there before me and I just thought, typical. I feel really bad about it. I decided to stand. And all of those people on that side died.
7/7, 2005, I'm afraid to say, you didn't get beyond this point.
It's a great day for me. I finished the journey and I was able to do it. I found it land in 2005. Today is one of the happiest days of my life. And I'm pleased I did it.
Wow, well done.
A new departure beckons. Thelma's personal quest for closure and a return to normality, a huge step closer. Kurt Barling, BBC London News.
Well, we heard from our Home Affairs correspondent.
Apparently that is the only time in 25 years when I've smiled on camera. It was a very emotional day for all of us. It did not make me any less of a journalist. I hope through these emblems of my journalistic oeuvre I can claim over 25 years to have made a contribution to challenging dominant narratives in the mainstream media. So where does that leave my assertions about subversion and journalism? A cameraman, a reporter and a producer are at a party political conference. They take a quick breather along the Blackpool promenade. They come across a lamp perched on top of a recycling bin. They all begin to inspect it. The cameraman likes the shiny reflection. The producer likes the visual metaphor that it could be used for. The reporter gets stuck in, picks it up and rubs it. A genie appears. The genie says, I'm not going to do a genie voice. I would normally grant 3 wishes, but as there are 3 of you, you'll have to share 1 each. Tell me what you want. The cameraman says, I want no money worries, and I want to lie forever more on a warm beach in the Caribbean. Immediately, he's transported to a lush, tropical island. The reporter says, I want a massive yacht, somewhere in the Med, near Saint-Tropez. Immediately, he finds himself with a fine wine in hand, waving across the bay to Roman Abramovich. Finally, the genie turns to the producer and says, and you, madam, what do you want? And she says, I want them both back after lunch because I've got this damn story to get on air for tea time. Journalism is no place for dreamers. It's not a journalist's job to project the world as they think it should be. A journalist's job is to work out and reflect on how the world actually is. Journalists must open the door to the discussion of remedies. In most fields, there are others much better equipped to argue whether one or t'other approach is right or wrong. In a democracy, there will rarely be one right answer. The open society needs plurality to survive. Journalists identify the problems, the tensions, the cleavages. They record what they find because the evidence leads them there. We need journalists and communicators who have a deep appreciation for the world around them, as well as the tools to articulate it. They need the brain to interpret it. It is not our job just to train journalists to write the first draft of history, but as Hemingway said, our job here in the University Academy is to train first-class crap detectors. There is no agreed scientific body of knowledge in journalism studies. That should not make them suspects. Craft skills need underpinning with a set of questioning values, rooted in a transdisciplinary approach on ethics, politics, economics, law, and communication, among other things. There are no universal truths either in journalism. The search for truth is a journey we embark on for the duration of our careers. You need to find method to navigate it. I've chosen the method of seeking out the alternative narrative to guide me. So should the practice of journalism be subversive. I believe the purpose of strong journalism should be to subvert attitudes, beliefs, and assumptions that foster idle thinking, uselessness of public purpose, and chaos. For this, journalism requires a plurality of voices and perspectives. It should not be the preserve of the elites. Now, digital transformation gives the educated voice a fresh opportunity to help preserve the open society from its enemies. In the University Academy, I know we can shape those new voices and critical minds. I trust we will help them make a difference. I believe we must keep the very heart of journalism subversive. Thank you for coming, and thank you for listening.